Connell then, and I'm going to talk to you about this one. So I work for Stack Overflow. I think hopefully that was obvious from the title. We have a monolith. It's a bit of a big ball of mud, and we are rebuilding little parts of that, but not as like a project in its own right. We're doing that incrementally. And now I've hit everything from the title. So this talk really is just a story. It's really just me talking about what we did a year and a half ago now, what our team did. We rebuilt the comments UI on Stack Overflow's question page. So it's just a story about that. There's nothing really groundbreaking in this talk, I don't think. Not expecting anybody to come out of this and go, wow, I've changed my mind about something. There's no revelations to come away with. Hopefully just maybe some, like a nostalgic nod, like a, yeah, maybe. Best case, I think. But with that caveat out of the way, let's make a start. So I usually talk about like software architecture and stuff, so I always start with something like this and say it's about boxes and arrows. And this slide I actually stole from a talk I did a couple of years ago now, where I spoke about, well, this is all our monolith, and I spoke about moving these two bits into a microservice. So we moved them out of the way, and they're now not in our monolith, but we're left with, well, more than 5 boxes realistically. You can imagine a few hundred of these. And this is the rest of our monolith. So we're going to do the comments UI. Are we going to do the same thing? Moving the comment stuff into a microservice, I think, would just be ridiculous. Two coupled, there's bits of comments that moving that to its own database would be ridiculous. So we do have another tool in our arsenal that we used for this, which was the Modular Monolith approach, if you've heard of this. I hadn't before. To give you a little, show what it looks like to us, we have this one library called module.base, and that just contains some interfaces for when you want to access the database, when you want to talk to the current user, like get request information. And we have a module, a big vertical slice, and we have like a few of these modules, and all they do is they can depend on stuff in module.base, but they don't depend on each other. So we can vertically slice things, meaning in here I have the UI, so it's .NET, so we have Razor views in this module, but we also have the business logic, and we also have the data access code, all in this module. We're slicing vertically rather than by horizontal architectural layers. So I mean, currently, let's throw some more boxes onto the screen. We've got bits of comments logic everywhere. It's all over the place. There's God objects that have, like the entity framework maps data onto them, but then they've got all this logic in there. They've got SQL queries in there. There's bits that are in the Razor views that have ended up containing logic. It's all over the place. So the goal really is, as we work on this stuff, we want to move the comment stuff into the module, and that's going to be the bit that's responsible for comments. Ideally. Not necessarily moving as in copy and pasting that across. We might rewrite some bits if things change. So really, that's the architectural goal. That's where we want to be. But if we go back to the title, the key word here is we're doing it incrementally. So we have, in terms of engineering, we have this goal, we have this vision-ish, we have this, like, this is where the end state should be, what the architecture wants to look like. But we need to align on that with the product side of things and how our engineering organization works, like shipping features incrementally. It's very agile and it's very experimental. Not that we don't necessarily know what we're doing, but yeah, we don't have a plan, like a roadmap that goes out 6 months into the future that we're going to do this by this deadline and the next bit by the next deadline. It's very, and I've put together this silly visualization of what I think experimentation means for us. If you're going on a path, you're walking down that bit, you release one bit, and then you get some feedback and you go, okay, we'll change direction a bit, we'll move it. We're still heading in the same-ish direction, but now we've decided to focus on something else. And now we'll walk this way. And then maybe we'll do something and decide we have to walk backwards. That was a mistake, so we'll roll that back. Silly little visualization, but that's what I'm trying to get across. That's our path, our experimentation. That's how we work. So how do we get from this bigger picture architectural plan, but we want to get there like this? We want to get there in an agile, experimental way. We don't really know what order we're going to release things in, but we know the area we're working in. So really, that's what this talk is about. It's just, as we went along this, some of this might feel a little bit disjointed. Some of it might feel like, why is he suddenly talking about that now? It's because it's basically done in chronological order. I'm explaining this crazy path that we walked. So each of these little turns, I said we respond to user feedback. How do we get user feedback? How do we know once we've released one bit, how do we know, let's change direction? What is that feedback that we get? So I've picked out, there are probably more, but I've picked out 4 ways that we can get feedback from users. Firstly, user interviews. We pay people. We pay people like yourselves, and we pay for focus groups. So we can ask people. We say, come and join us on a Google Meet call, and we can show you some new designs, and we can ask you what you think. And people might go, well, I think this button would do that, or I think the wording here means this. And we can test that with a few people and get some feedback. So that's one thing we do. We have teams of people, UX researchers, their titles are, that do this almost exclusively, along with other bits. And also I've joined a few of them. So like, engineers and product team, UX designers, we can join these calls and sit in on them, and I can ask questions to the users. So yeah, my last company did that as well. This is a pretty common practice, like focus groups, user interviews. But then there's me as well, with a bit less hair, but I'm an engineer. I'm a developer. I've used Stack Overflow for years. Long before I worked there, I had an account and I was asking questions to try and get some fake internet points, years and years ago. And then so are all the other engineers that work there. So this is something I didn't have at my last company. I'm a user of the product that we make. So I can use my own intuition as I'm making those little trade-offs, those little design decisions day to day. I can think about it as a user myself as well. What would I prefer the product do in certain situations? So that we've got like 100 or so engineers, and the same with the focus groups. We've probably, it's in the tens or hundreds that we've interviewed. They're both small subsets of the users. The user base is in the millions. And these are small, and they're both biased subsets as well. Obviously, being an engineer there's a bias, and the people who will click on an email link to get paid to do an interview, there's a bias there as well. So that's two ways we can get feedback. The third way I've picked out is what we call the meta sites. So for those that don't know, so Stack Overflow is a Q&A website about programming. And then we also have, it's part of the Stack Exchange network. So we have hundreds of these. I think it's about 150. And there's it's the same monolith. We just deploy it with a different database and slightly different themes. So you've got one about chess. There's one about music theory, world building, the English language, just other communities, other Q&A websites. Same thing. It's like a different tenant, I guess. And each of those sites also have another site, which we call the meta site, which is another Q&A website and another community where the topic of conversation is the site itself. Does that make sense? That's why it's meta. So meta.stackoverflow.com is a Q&A website about how Stack Overflow works. And people can ask questions about, should I ask a question this? Or they can raise a bug or ask for a new feature. And the community on there is the staff, but then it's also the moderators of the Stack Overflow website, maybe moderators of the other Stack Exchange sites, or just power users, people that have used the site for 10 years, 15 years, people that are really invested in the community there. And we can get feedback from that. My last company would have paid big money to have this sort of thing. Engaged users that can give you feedback on the changes you make, and it's just written there in front of you. So that's our third way of getting feedback. But again, it's a small subset. There's only a few hundred users, and again, there's a bias to it. So the fourth way that we can get feedback from our users is through A/B testing. I think often we sort of use a synonym for, we say experimentation, which is kind of different, but kind of similar. This is how we're doing it. A/B testing, for those that don't know, very quickly, you have a UI. You can make two versions of the UI, 1A, 1B. You can send 50% of your traffic to see one screen, 50% to another, and you make a slight tweak to it. You can say this one's green, got a green button, or put it in caps, or we can put some UI elements saying, click this one, and then we can compare the results. Which of these is performing better? Do you get more clicks on this button if it's green and it's got arrows to say, click this one? And you can make some graphs. This is obviously a fake graph that I've done in Apple's Keynote, but we use Databricks, all our events land in there, and we do have data scientists that go and give the official results of these experiments, and they look into how things work. But we're encouraged to do the same. So I can log into Databricks, I can ask the Python AI thing to write me some PySpark code and get some fancy graphs. And no spoilers, but at the end of this talk, I'll show you what I found for this big experiment that we did, that the talk is about. You test these different UIs, which one's getting more clicks, bigger bar, bigger numbers. So the first, engineering problem we came across as we're doing this, how do we split those groups into 50-50? Half people see this, half people see that. We did, or still do, have some experimentation platforms. We've been doing A/B testing long before I worked there. But for reasons out of the scope of this talk, we wanted to move away from those systems that we were using. So what we did was, we already had, and still have, a feature flagging system where we can tell it which users see the feature. So if I called my feature big green button, and when that feature flag is set to true, the button is green, what I can do is say, in this text box, user number 1234, and I can just drop a user ID into this text box and say that user now has the feature enabled. So when it does the feature flag check, if they're logged in as that user, it's true. I can comma separate this, so I can put a list of user IDs in here. This already existed. We have these rules of different things that we can put in this box. We can say, I want to enable this feature for logged in users. So now if you're not logged in, you're logged out, feature is disabled. The minute you log in, it's enabled. We can have moderators. We can put staff as a rule. So we can say, I want to enable a feature for employees only first, and we can test it ourselves in production, and then roll it out for more people. What we added here was the percentage option. So I can now say, I want to enable this for 50% of the users, and now 50% of users have the feature flag set to true. And that allows us to do this A/B testing. And obviously not just 50, you can put 1% if you want, enable it for a smaller percentage of people. So how does this rule work? I'd like to try and explain some more visualizations. Imagine this is all your users, and you take one of them. What we need for this rule, this 50% rule to work, is we need a function that's going to give us a number for a user. So let's say I'm going to pass in my user as a parameter to this calculate number function. And this user is going to get 0.3 come out as their number. We're going to put this user on a line from 0 to 1. And then when I'm saying 50%, I'm basically asking, is their number less than 0.5? And if another user comes along and their number is 0.75, they go on this side of the line, they're not included in the 50%, so the feature flag will be disabled for this user but enabled for them. And you put every user on the line somewhere from 0 to 1. So one of the requirements of this function is that when I say the user's number is less than 0.5, that needs to actually be 50% of the population. So it can't all be, I can't have everybody's number just being over here, because 50% needs to mean half the users. So it needs to be evenly spread out across this line. That's like the first requirement, I guess, for our function, evenly spread out between 0 and 1. So when I say 25%, it needs to be a quarter of the users. When I say 1%, it needs to be, of course, 1% of the users. But then if I want to increase from 1% to 10%, another requirement is that I need the 1% to still be in the 10%. So I need it to not, does that make sense? I never really know how to explain that, so nod your heads if you're following. It needs to not reshuffle the line when I change the percentage, so that I can gradually roll it out to 100%. I can introduce it to more users as it goes along, and it's not people having the feature enabled and then disabled and then enabled again. So this allows us to do a canary rollout as well. Another advantage, not what the talk is about, but that same feature allows us to also, I can enable something for staff first, then 1% of users, leave it for a few days, see if there's an error, roll it out to 10% next, then 50%, do an A/B test, all with this same percentage feature flagging system. So that function, we only really had two requirements, evenly spread out, and it needs to be deterministic. It needs to give the same number to the same user so that we can gradually roll out. I'm going to show you a really simplified version of what that function looks like. You need to get a string, you need to get an identifier, that's the deterministic part, something that uniquely identifies this user. So we can use the user ID, obviously dot to string if it's a number, and then you can fall back for users who are not logged in. You can use the IP address, some best effort. You can try and use some cookies, GDPR, and whether they've allowed tracking cookies aside. So some complicated stuff, but best case to find a string that uniquely identifies or tries to the user, and then throw it in a hash. Doesn't need to be a fancy hash, just an MD5 hash, doesn't need to be super secure, just something to turn this unique string into that's what gives us that randomness. And then we get the last 4 bytes of the MD5 hash. Don't ask me why. Maybe somebody can actually explain this to me. The first 4 bytes of an MD5 hash isn't evenly spread out on that line. Don't know why. Last 4 bytes are. First 4 bytes, you get you get clumps. I don't know why. Last 4 bytes seem random enough, though, that it's an evenly spread out line. Then, to get a number between 0 and 1, you divide it by its max value. And there you go. You've got your number between 0 and 1. That's pretty much the function. It was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be when we thought we had the idea. We actually pass in the feature name as a parameter to this function, and we use that as like a salt on the hash. And what this does is it reshuffles that line for every new feature. So the feature name can be, green button or green button enabled, if that's your setting for your feature flag. What this means is you don't get one user that's always going to deterministically be 0.01 and they're always going to get the new features first. Every new feature, the line is completely reshuffled and a user might be at the end next time. So that's the function. Okay, little reminder of our UI. You may know what the Stack Overflow question page looks like. It looks a little bit nicer than this, but I've just thrown some whatever Apple's keynote gives me. So you've got the title at the top, you've got the body, you've got the upvotes and the score, and then you've got the user's name over here and their reputation points and the date. There, that's the question. Then you have the number of answers, and Bob's fell for the trap, look, isn't he? Rightfully downvoted to oblivion. And looks pretty much like the question, same sort of UI element. Underneath the answer, we then have the comments. This is the area that we're working in. They're slightly smaller, they're indented, they can't be downvoted. There's no reputation points on them. That's the area we're working in. That's what we've been told. And this actually came from, those forms of feedback. We had some user feedback described these as the small answers, sometimes the answers in the comments. That was quite interesting. If people haven't got used to the sort of Stack Overflow way of doing things over the last 10, 15 years, the small answers, I found that mildly humorous. Anyway, this is where we're working. This is what we're going to try and make some improvements in. And that's basically the brief we got, improve this. So now we need to experiment. We need to work out what it is. We've got the area that we're working in. We know how we want to architect it, but we don't even know what we're doing yet. So first thing we did, that add a comment bit there, that's a button, not just a grayed out link or anything. That was a button. What happened before was when you click the button, text box appears, you can type your comment in, press go, comment appears. What we decided to do first was when you hit add a comment, we're going to come up with a drop-down option to try and gauge what people are doing with the comments. Are they trying to use them like Reddit comments? Are they trying to use them like YouTube comments? Like some people get their comments deleted because they're only saying thanks. So we'll give them a drop-down box and we're just going to track what the user's intent is. We're going to ask them directly with this drop-down box. And now I'm going to slide over to some code. So park that. How does that look? So at the moment, very simplified, HTML, some DOM. We've got the big comments div, that's the area that we're working in. You've got a list of the comments, and then you have that button. And obviously fill in the list items with all of the information. We're a .NET shop. We use Razor, and the interactivity, the JavaScript stuff would have been jQuery, and still is all the old stuff that was written 10 years ago. So that's what the comments is like. But our modern front ends that we build in Svelte. Has anybody heard, or Svelte, I think it's. Has anybody heard of Svelte or Svelte? If you haven't, it's just like React or Vue or Angular. It's another front end framework. Our modern stuff is built in Svelte. And this is a Razor view. So our front end guilds have quite kindly given us a HTML helper for our Razor that we can say embed an island. We call it an interactive island of Svelte. And then comment dash drop down there. That's our Svelte component. And that's made in a different thing. So how that gets rendered to the page, the HTML that actually lands on the page, it's an empty div. So nothing really in there, but that's got the ID that I gave to the HTML helper. We have these arguments. This is JSON, not JavaScript. So this wouldn't get executed in the browser. This is just arbitrary, I think of it like a view model, really. It's the thing that you can give your partial view. You can give it to a component. So it's just a JSON object or array. It's whatever it gets serialized as. The real execution comes from this. So then we have a script with a source, and that's a JavaScript file. And we actually would have put the type in there. So the browser will execute that script. What does that look like? We import mount from Svelte. Svelte's framework, runtime, I don't think you can call it a runtime. Import mount from Svelte. The mount function is the thing that's going to put our component onto the page. We import our comments dropdown, which is our Svelte component. So there's a .svelte file that will be it kind of looks a bit like HTML, and then there's the script tag that it executes. It's even got some CSS in there, sort of a web component-y type thing. That's the stuff, that's the dropdown that we've built. We have to go and get our empty div. So it's a get element by ID, just native JavaScript. We get the empty div, the target element. We also get the arguments, and we pass them, they're JSON. So now we have an object, a JavaScript object that is our arguments. And then we call that mount function. We pass it our comments dropdown. We tell it the target. So go and render the dropdown into our empty div with these properties. So that's what that JS file, that's what the browser executes. And now, hooray, dropdown box is going to appear on the page. The client, the browser, is going to build these DOM elements. So the browser doesn't see the .svelte file, it sees compiled JavaScript, so it's all document.create elements. So the browser is going to go and build up these DOM elements, build up this dropdown, plonk it into that empty div on the page, and then I can't remember how we actually got it to appear. We might have actually used a bit of jQuery to get the actual comment link to go and make that visible. So yeah, client-side rendered JavaScript dropdown. What did we put in it? Our actual component had, first option was comment with a clarification, which is basically leave a comment. Is what it did before. So you hit that, now the text box appears and you can type your comment in. But we also added a say thanks. This helped me. A lot of the comments were just people saying thanks. And moderators then go and delete the thanks comments, and people didn't like that because it clutters the page. There's always argument. So what we did, this button basically just didn't come up with the comment text box after you clicked it. It said, thank you, we have told that the user, they said thank you, and then they just got a little notification, you have been thanked by this many users. And we had discussed this answer. This was kind of controversial. We had another feature on the Stack Overflow site called discussions. It was not used as much, so it's not a question and answer. It was intended for open-ended debate. Looked a bit similar to a Q&A, but there was no accept answer, green checkbox or anything, and it was called discussions. It had different moderators and different things happened over there. This was like a way to drive traffic to that feature. So if somebody clicked that, it would start a new discussion on the discussions feature referencing the answer that we're talking about. And we went live with this, and people started these discussions. Had a couple of weeks. A lot of those discussions then got closed by the discussions mods because they weren't appropriate for discussions. So there weren't comments, there weren't discussions, there weren't answers. So we ended up changing the text for this final one. I put a red circle around it. Ask a follow-up question is what we went to next. This wasn't A/B tested. We just kind of changed it, and we're looking what that changed. People were asking different questions. The wording is totally different, but now people were using the discussions feature for a different reason. And it also changed what people were clicking comment with a clarification for. And this stuff was really hard to find numbers to, like anything quantitative. We were really just looking at these discussions that people were starting and the comments people were leaving and the number of thanks comments that were being reduced and how many people were clicking thanks. As humans, and we were trying to categorize things, maybe we could have got an LLM to try and categorize the sorts of things people were asking, but just changing this copy, just changing this text, changed what the users were trying to do when they were leaving these comments or starting these discussions. And then when you did start a discussion or a follow-up question, we sort of linked to it in a fake comment. You couldn't upvote this comment, but it appeared in the comments list, and that follow-up question linked you over to the discussion. So when we proposed this, people, at least on this, so we've done our user feedback originally before we started this. We've obviously analyzed it ourselves as users, and we've proposed it to our meta community. Here's what we're planning to do. People liked it. People liked the idea of this. But when we actually rolled this out, people didn't like it. Lots of downvotes, and people, again, this is the qualitative feedback you can get. This is hard to put into numbers, but you can read responses, real people giving feedback, real users giving feedback for the feature. a lot of this came down to, well, I think new users should have it to try and like guide them into what comments should be, but I don't think I should have this drop-down box because I know what a comment is. And especially users who are leaving 1,000 comments a day, and I'm not even joking, 1,000 comments a day, they're saying this is an extra click in my workflow. I now have to click the drop-down and click the clarify with a comment or whatever we called it. So they didn't like it. They wanted it to be certain users who got it. So again, we're experimenting. We can change path. Okay, what do we do now? We released an opt-out switch. So people that care about it and they didn't want this drop-down, they can go and opt out of experiments. Now, why did I do it as a general opt-out? 2 reasons. One, we didn't want to set the precedent that a user profile would now have 100 different switches for every little feature that we're going to release, and everybody can just opt out of anything. So that was one reason. But if I'm totally honest, it was just easier to implement like this. There was already a bit field on the profile that I could reuse for this switch. And it meant, going back to our feature flagging system, it meant I can just create a new rule that goes not opt out. So now when I'm enabling a feature, I can say 50% of people except those who have opted out. They don't have the feature enabled. They, if anything, the feature flag resolves to false. They fall into the A group, the current group. So when we're doing an A/B test now, and this is one of the things we didn't kind of think about when we did this, the A/B test was splitting 50-50 current and the new UI. But now we're allowing people to opt out, so they go into the other group. So now it's not a 50-50 split. And this is not to scale, by the way, it was less than 1% of people who actually did opt out, but it was an important 1% because it was the people that, if there was a bias to this, it would be people that leave lots of comments. It will be people that use the site more often. It will be people that even knew there was an opt-out switch to opt out from. So people that either clicked around the user profile a lot, like browsed the site, or people that saw my post saying we're introducing this opt-out. But that's fine. We can remove these from our data when we're doing our A/B test analysis. We can say, okay, fine, let's analyze these 2 groups of people. But, and this is the bit we didn't think of, what about the people that would have opted out if they were in the new group, but they didn't because they didn't need to, because they didn't see the drop-down. They didn't get the new feature, so they never felt inclined to go along and opt out. And this would have been the same type of user who did opt out when they were in this group. So you can imagine, is this making sense? I always found this quite hard to explain as well, but people who would be inclined to opt out, we've excluded from the data on one side, but not the other. So now when I'm looking at this and running numbers and going, well, do we get more comments in group A or B? Well, obviously we got more in A because there's a bias. The people that are leaving thousands of comments haven't opted out over there. So there's the populations are skewed. So it became really difficult to get anything from comparing the old and new stuff because of this bias that we've introduced through this opt-out switch. So we learned some stuff. We learned what users were trying to do. The UX researchers took all this away. We turned off the drop-down, so we killed it. No more drop-down, but we've got the data. We understand more about our users. We understand this idea of follow-up questions now, rather than discuss this answer. We think we've found like a gap of things people are trying to do on Stack Overflow that there's not a home for them. So now the UX teams and the product teams, everybody's going to go away and we're going to come up with what we're going to do next. What's our next experiment? What's our next thing? And they came, this is what the comments look like now. They came back with this. They changed everything. They moved everything into a different place and they put buttons around things. Now, let's just compare old versus new. These were the designs that we've this is going to be our next experiment. This is what we're going to do. There's so many changes that I had to write them down. We've got a profile picture now. It's being displayed on the comment. We've put the name and the profile picture above the text rather than being an afterthought, or you go -Charlie. We've got their reputation and their badges in there now. The upvote we've put in like a button, so it's more obviously a button. Maybe people didn't know that you could click that. The flag that was there, that's now in this ... menu. There's a reply button now. That wasn't there before. That basically is the same as adding a new comment, but we knew we want to introduce threading, like Reddit-style threads, so that was going to then start a thread under this one, but not yet, all incremental. There's an edit and delete as well. That happened on hover over there. They're now more obviously in that. So yeah, lots of changes, and we're going to A/B test these two completely different UIs. So that's what our UI looks like. We're doing a new UI. This is a whole new UI, and as I said earlier, we use Svelte for new UIs, right? So we're going to use Svelte for this new UI. Well, there's a problem. All the stuff I mentioned earlier was client-side rendered. The browser built those DOM elements and then put it into that empty div for the dropdown. For the actual comment information, we really need it to be server rendered for two reasons. One, search engine optimization, SEO. I'm sure Google can execute some JavaScript and see what's on the page now, but I hear it's better for SEO if this stuff, the actual comment, is in the HTML response that comes to the browser, not something that's rendered with JavaScript that your browser just puts on as an afterthought. So we wanted that to be server rendered. But even search engine optimization aside, accessibility. I think, so we did another experiment. How many of our users don't even use JavaScript? And it was like 15 people in 1,000, but that's still 15 people in 1,000. And they'll have JavaScript turned off for various reasons. We don't want them not to be able to see the comments. So we need this to be server rendered. And unfortunately, we do server rendering in Razor. So we have a Razor view for this. It looks something like this. Now, it's basically the same, but you've got to add a comment above rather than below now. That's the big button. But then when it came to the interactivity, so we did actually server rendered, did that new UI. All of the interactivity, all of the JavaScript stuff, so upvoting, adding a new comment, what else is there, flagging, anything, any of these things, you need to be logged in for all of that stuff. So actually, we went live with this UI for anonymous users, and that was fine because all of the interactivity was irrelevant. So without any JavaScript, we did actually test this out on anonymous users. If they tried to do anything, they just got a sign-up prompt. But when we needed to add the interactivity, we need some JavaScript. Now, what we're going to do with JavaScript, because we use jQuery for the Razor stuff, right? So we import, oh no, okay, so we're using Svelte. We are using Svelte. We've actually redone, we've done an exact same thing that we've done in Razor, but we've also built it in Svelte now. So we've got two identical UIs, one of them written in Svelte, one of them written in Razor. What could possibly go wrong? We are then going to go and get our div, but it's not an empty div this time. This div that we're going to render in it is the comments. It is the div that contains the comments. And we're going to mount onto that. And what Svelte does is it wipes everything in that comments div. When you do mount, it goes inner HTML equals empty string, and then it puts those client-side rendered DOM elements in place in that div. And the theory is, and I know this is such a stupid idea, but the theory is, if it's identical, if the UI is pixel perfect, every padding, every margin, every color is absolutely identical to what was before, you shouldn't notice. There should be no layout shift, no repaint. These DOM elements will just change and you won't notice, in theory. We called this the Indiana Jones for obvious reasons. Look, the idle is our Razor view that's in there on the browser. And what we're going to do is try and swap in the Svelte UI and hope that nobody notices. Honestly, we called this the Indiana Jones. That's what the feature flag is called. It's littered all over our code. We've got Jira tickets about the Indiana Jones. I'm told it's a hilarious reference. So the Svelte stuff, that's because we're using mount from Svelte, and that's going to replace. So you don't want to use mount, apparently. SvelteKit wants to use hydrate. Hydrate, roughly the same thing, same signature, but hydrate's intended to take the server-rendered elements that will be rendered on the server side using usually Node.js, and then it's meant to attach click handlers and attach that interactivity without having to wipe the DOM elements and replace them. So it will keep them there. That's what we ideally want to use. But when the Svelte client-side code tries to hydrate onto just some random DOM elements, it blows up. You get an error saying hydration error, and it just uses mount anyway. Svelte is expecting the server-rendered HTML to have very specific IDs, like randomly generated IDs. We thought, could we get our Razor view to do that? No. I think that was just going to be way too complicated, and probably we're never going to achieve that. So really what we need is to actually get Node.js to render this on the server side, and then from our .NET application, we need to make a call to a Node.js application. So that was the next step we're trying to take. So we use Kubernetes, so we made a Node.js container. We put it in the same Kubernetes pod as the .NET container. And then we use this library, this NuGet package called Jering or Jering or Jeering, maybe, .javascript.node.js. And that's basically just a NuGet package that allows you to invoke Node.js functions from .NET. So great, we could even do that from our Razor view if we wanted to be horrible about it. We can have a little bit of code that goes invoke and it calls Node.js. Node.js goes and renders our Svelte component, the comments component, on the server side. We give it the view model as well. It returns our HTML. We can stitch that HTML into the rest of the Razor view, respond to the client with HTML. And that does work, but it was very, very bad performance. So this invocation took like 100 milliseconds. It wasn't good. So we couldn't actually go live with that. That's the main question page, and we can't drop that by 100 milliseconds. But we did find a way. I'm going to draw a sequence diagram now. Do you remember those? So the request comes in to the .NET side of things. Yeah, handle request. We then, there's a SQL database in here as well, so we ask SQL for all of the comments and the scores and everything that's going to be on the page. So this is a rewrite. So all of the old comment stuff, there was a few different SQL queries that happen at different times. We managed to get it down to one query that basically gives us the entire view model that we need, put that into our nice little module in our monolith, and then we send that view model over to Node.js. Now, say go and render the comments component, and then meanwhile, while it's doing all the rendering, we can do other stuff in parallel. We can go and get the stuff that's going to be in the top bar. We can get the stuff that's going to be in the sidebar and the stuff that's on the main question page. So we do a few other SQL queries, click this button a few more times, and then eventually get to the Razor view. This was an asynchronous task that we just didn't await at the time. So it starts the task. We await the task here, and then we get the response, and we can stitch that HTML into the response, send that to the client. What actually happened was when we do this await for the task, it's already completed, usually. So actually, we ended up improving the performance of the question page somehow. I didn't have that on my bingo card list, but somehow by doing this, we've taken the load off of what was in .NET and Razor to render the comment section. We've now just passed that off to a separate Node.js process that happens in parallel, and we've somehow improved the performance of the page. Mind blown. But meanwhile, so all of this is going on. Do you remember me from earlier? Me with no hair? Well, I'm doing that stuff, and so is one of my colleagues. Two of my other colleagues are working also in parallel. I know, awful segue, but had to be done. They're also working on shipping new features. We're experimenting. And everything they do, everything they wrote in the Razor view, we were also having to recreate. Every little padding change. We've changed this to 6 pixels of padding instead of 4. We had to do that in the Svelte. We were always a few days behind when we were getting these layout shifts. So yeah, while all that's happening, shipping features. Here is us going to the meta community about some of our features. Very poorly received, this one. Look at that, minus 410 downvotes. People really didn't like this new comments UI, everything together. So that was the qualitative feedback. I have to take the blame for some of this. Probably the main point of feedback was that it was the comment system. Originally, it was designed by the UX team as a separate, like side-by-side system, so you could have comments, and they called these follow-ups. And it was me that went, actually, maybe we should use the comment system. That would be easier to iterate on. Like the database is already there, it would be simpler. That ended up being one of the biggest points of contention. But there were other things as well, so we can read all of this feedback and get some ideas of what it is we need to change, what's the direction we need to take this in. And that was the qualitative feedback, but also the numbers were bad. By basically any measurement, any metric that we could find, anything, amount of comments, amount of upvotes, amount of users who were leaving comments and users who were upvoting, anything we looked at, the number of flags were going up, all bad. So that backed up the qualitative data that we've got from the feedback on Meta. But the problem is we've done so many different things here. We've changed so many UI elements, it's hard to draw any causality. What is it that's changed the numbers? Is it the fact that we've used a bigger font? Is it a fact that we've put the user profile there? Is it the fact that we're using Svelte? Maybe we messed something up with our Indiana Jones. So we don't know what it is. We need to do some science, some real science, some actual experimentation where we make one variable and see if that one variable changes things, rather than changing all of this stuff. So we're going to do some smaller experiments now, and we're going to change one little factor. Can you see the factor we're changing on this A/B test? Give you a clue. It's there. It's the reputation, the badges. We're going to see, maybe that makes a difference. We weren't doing that before. Maybe the fact that we've added the reputation now, like the answers and questions, maybe that changes how people want to reply to these things. But we'd already gone live with this UI. So we figured, why don't we just change it to that, and then we can compare our results to last week, right? But unfortunately, that is not good science, because you've now got another variable. You've got the week. And one thing we totally forgot was the second week had a US public holiday. So a quarter of our users weren't working on the Thursday or whatever. So that messed up all the numbers. We ended up having to do it as an A/B test anyway. So we wasted another week on that. But when we actually did do the A/B test for that one, bear in mind, by the way, we're doing all of this twice. We've still got the Razor view and the Svelte thing. Two of my colleagues doing the same changes, removing the reputation in Razor and in Svelte. And we did a lot of these small experiments twice. Yeah, so next experiment. Oh, we did do the A/B test, by the way, and removing the rep was good. We got slightly better numbers, so don't know why. Maybe people find it intimidating to reply to somebody that has more badges and reputation. Maybe vice versa. Maybe people don't want to reply when there's a lower rep. Didn't dig further into that, but we started doing some more experiments. What about this one? Can you spot this one? It's the font size, because we increased the font size. The old comments was, I think, 10 points, and this was the same size as the answers and questions. So maybe it's that. Maybe it is literally just the font size. Let's try that. That's an easy test. And then we did another one, this one. Bit more obvious, this one. Obviously, it's the user. We put the user back to how it was in the old comments, where it came after. I know this is two variables, but it just made sense with the way the divs were set up. So whether the avatar is displayed next to the name and whether the user comes after or above the actual comment text. Those two things. So that was another experiment we ran. And each of these experiments are taking 2 weeks, apparently. I'm not a data scientist, but to get to statistical significant, we have to run these for 2 weeks. Unless it's very obvious, like you can run it for days and it turns out one is obviously running better, but 2 weeks was what we were advised. And if we were going to do all of these, that was going to take forever, and it takes me a lot less than 2 weeks to change the font size. So I had this experiment, an idea, a dangerous thing, I know, that what if we ran both of those at the same time and had 4 different UIs? So 4 variants of the UI. And what I'm doing here is these two have the small font, these two have the large font, these two have this avatar, and then those two over there have the profile picture and the avatar at the top. So 4 variants with 2 variables. So 2 to the power of 2, you get 4 variables. And my theory is that if those are 2 feature flags, both set to 50%, randomly distributed because we threw the feature name, remember that pink bit that reshuffles the line, then we should get 4 evenly sized populations just from the evaluation of 2 coin flips, basically. And we did test this just to make sure. We did get 25% of users falling each. So the randomness was random, it turns out. We did get 4 evenly sized populations, evenly spread out. So we can assign them to the 4 different UIs. And then my theory is that if I evaluate the difference between these 2 populations, the only difference, this is I think science, the only difference between these populations is they see the avatar and they see the user afterwards. And there are various things like in each population. You could say that, yeah, 50% of these have the small font though, and 50% of them, but so do those. You can also say 25% of these users are from the USA. So are 25% of those. You can say 1% of these users are moderators. Surely they, yeah, but 1% of those are moderators. The only variable between these 2 populations is the avatar. And you can say exactly the same about this split as well. The only variable is the font. Yes, both populations have 50% splits on the avatar, but also both of them have 1% of moderators and however many percentage from Canada, from India. So all the populations are the same except the one variable. So, you know, some people disagreed with me. One of the data scientists really disagreed with me, but I couldn't find a solid reason, really. Nobody could really explain. If somebody has a solid reason, can somebody explain why that's a bad idea? Please do. But we went ahead with it. So we've got these 4 variants, and let's see what happens. We're experimenting. Let's experiment with experiments. Why not? We didn't just do 4. We had 8, because we added another variable in there. This one's really simple. This is just the date. the date where it says, like the little gray text there, capped means if the date was over a year ago, we will literally print the string over a year ago. One, because it was just easy to do this. That's a very simple if statement in the code. But the theory or the hypothesis was that maybe people weren't replying to 10-year-old threads because it's 10 years old and they think it's all dead. Whereas if we kind of hide that information, maybe that encourages, I don't know, I didn't really like it, but I like the idea of an 8-variant experiment. In fact, it was a 9-variable experiment because we still got the control from the old UI. So this was another feature flag, which I set to 89%. So roughly 89% of people see the new UI, and then of those, you've got 3 coin flips. So very, well, not roughly, almost exactly, 11% in each group of the population. 9 variables. Do you want to see some results? Do you want to see how that went? Remember I said I can pull some stuff from Databricks. This is not the official data scientist results, but this is just me going to pull some numbers from doing a 9-variant test. And there you go, yeah, thanks for coming. Can you imagine? That's what I managed to pull off. I'll talk you through them, don't worry. These here. So all of those bar charts have the same bars in them. I'll explain what they are, and each refer a different metric. Top one here is comments conversion rate. So that is of the people who could leave a comment, so that's including people who are locked or if the post they're looking at is locked. So if you could leave a comment when you load the page, did you leave the comment? That's a conversion. That's how, so that was quite complicated to work out, but if you could leave a comment, that was the denominator, and if you did, that was the numerator. And then same here, this is upvotes. So if you could leave an upvote, that's the denominator. If you actually did, that's upvotes. That's the nominator. And so the bars, these are the 9 variants that we're doing. So each individual UI there, A to I. This orange bar here is the average, I guess. We're talking proportions anyway. So it's all of the test groups together, excluding the control. So yes, it's 8 times the size, like the population is 8 times the size as the control, but it's a proportion, right? That should be fine, I think. So that's all the tests. And then these ones here are my theory of just comparing the populations for each variable. So top here would be all of the 3 groups that have top, the user at the top. And like small here is the 3 groups that have the small font versus the 3 groups that have the large font. And then just some interesting things to look at. So look at that. When you put the user profile there, the avatar, and put the user at the top, there was like a 20% lift in upvotes from users. I think probably there's like that human element to it. Now I'm focusing more on who did it. I'm adding the picture there. I'm adding the user first instead of being a little after remark. Maybe that personal human touch encourages you to upvote more. But I'm told these are all statistically significant, but that just looks very significant to me. This one, the font, this is fascinating. With a small font, people leave more comments and larger comments. It's on the graph down there, but longer comments, more characters. But with a larger font, people upvote them more. And I think this one, again, this is just my sort of thinking, not proven data, but not proven facts. I think there's an element of self-censoring. So if something is going to be larger and more prominent, you might write it in a way that you know more people are going to look at it. So maybe you censor yourself. Maybe you don't leave certain comments if you think more people are going to see it. But if it's smaller and less significant, maybe you do. I only think on Slack, I'm happy to reply with a little tick emoji, but I might not write yes because it gives somebody a notification. I think it's the same sort of thinking, but I don't know that at all. So this is the same 2 metrics and the same bars, but the entire population I'm looking at is only users with less than 50 reputation points. Because before our changes, you weren't able to comment if you had less than 50 reputation points. That's why the control is so low, because on the control, most of the time you couldn't comment. You'll notice it's not 0 because there are scenarios that you can comment even if you don't have the reputation points, such as commenting on an answer to your own question, which is quite common. And the reason we did this was some theories, hypotheses, ideas, was that our changes were affecting new users differently to existing users. People that were used to the old UI and had used the site for 15 years may act differently to those who are just coming out of university and are used to using sites like Reddit. And there's no difference. There's statistically, all the numbers are slightly different, but the trends are all exactly the same for new users and old users. To dig further into that, I got these are box plots, and we looked at the user's reputation, how often the user visits the website, and how old that user's account is. And I did each of the variables across them, and this is only counting those who converted. So those who left comments is that top graph. And if it was affecting populations differently, you'd expect to see some large differences, especially like over here. But it certainly looks to me like, well, the font and the date being capped seems to have basically no impact on how old your user account is or how much you use the site. You could probably make the case that putting the user at the top here does seem to favor older users with higher reputation that visit the site more often, that have older accounts, which seems backwards to me. I would have expected the opposite. But yeah, it's not very significant. These are very small margins. Basically, and here is what's called a KDE, a kernel density estimate. I had to write it down. I can't explain why there's more blue on this. It should be even orange and blue. But this is all of the test groups, that orange bit, the 8 times population versus the control. And if we were seeing, for example, more comments from new users, you'd expect to see like a skew where it's blue on one side and orange on the other. But it's not what we see. Look, it's not even, like, where it says 0 there in the axis, it's not even managed to find me a number so small to give me anything relevant there. These lines are so tight. It's not affecting new users differently to old. And then finally, this is the results, like what happened to comments left by those UIs afterwards. So the score there, that is the number of upvotes the comments get regardless of where it's being upvoted from. So I don't care if those upvotes have came from users who see the large font or the small font. All I care about is comments left with a small font, did they get more upvotes? So comments, yeah, the font, fascinating. Comments left with a larger font tended to get a higher score, regardless of whether they were being upvoted, irrelevant of whether they were seen with a small font or a larger font. Comments that were left for users who thought their font was going to be larger were higher. And this is the number of flags. So, bigger number bad. Comments left from users who thought their font was going to be smaller were much more likely to be flagged as not an answer or as offensive. And again, I think this is the self-censoring. I think this is, if you think your comment's going to be a little small thing, maybe you put something offensive, or you're more likely to put something offensive in there. But if you think it's going to be more prominent, you self-censor. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you very much for coming to my talk.